Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. We're back for another macabre tale from history to mark the run-up to Halloween. Today we're heading back to the early 17th century to look at the life of an individual who is said by some to have been the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. A woman who came to be known as the Blood Countess. It's often a sign of a particularly old and particularly powerful noble family if they have a legendary origin story, which was the case for the Bathory family. In a post for historycollection.com, which I will link, Natasha Sheldon recounts how the Bathory family dated the start of their most famous or infamous name to the 10th century, and to the bravery of one of their forebears, a warrior by the name of Vitus. Brave Vitus was called upon to deal with a dragon that was dragoning about and being a general scary nuisance in the swamps around Ecsed in Hungary. Taking his lance in hand, Vitus became a dragon slayer. He was rewarded with Ecsed, its castle, and a new surname, Bathory, which apparently can be translated to mean a good hero. The other less dragony suggestion is that the name connects to the Bathory estate, which came into the family's possession at the start of the 14th century. So Bathory refers to the estate itself as they were now of Bathory. Nevertheless, the Bathory family's achievement of arms was certainly very clearly influenced by the earlier dragon myth. By the time the subject of today's video was born, on the 7th of August 1560, the Bathory family was one of the most prominent in the Kingdom of Hungary, which was also called Royal Hungary. They were celebrated military men, powerful administrators and holders of high ecclesiastical positions. They were kings, cardinals, knights and judges. There was not a corner of power into which they were unable to venture. Members of the family held positions like Palatine of Hungary, which was the highest ranking representative of the monarch in Hungary, basically a feudal lord. The Voivode of Transylvania, who was the highest ranking representative of the monarch in Transylvania and essentially a semi-independent ruler. The Prince of Transylvania, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Another thing that is common with old, prominent families is the presence of cadet branches. From two of these Bathory branches, the Ecsed and the Somlyo ones, came the parents of the baby who would grow up to be the Blood Countess, Elizabeth Báthory. Through her parents' marriage, familial power was consolidated, so their influence was given a broader reach, and quite the influence they had. Through her father, Baron George VI Bathory, her uncle, Andrew Bonaventura Bathory, was the Voivode of Transylvania. Elizabeth's mother, Baroness Anna Bathory, was also good at providing her daughter with powerful uncles, because Anna's brother Stephen was, through his marriage, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. He was also Prince of Transylvania. Elizabeth was reportedly beautiful. She came from a very powerful family, they were wealthy, and she was enviably educated. Indeed, it seems that a passion for learning would continue into adulthood for Elizabeth, and it's said that she would write to other nobles with requests to borrow their books on a variety of topics, both scientific and philosophical. She may have been an epileptic, or at least experienced seizures in her childhood. Elizabeth was betrothed to the man who would become her husband when she was around 11 years old, and they would marry in 1575 when she was nearly 15. Her new husband was Count Ferenc Nadasi, and it's said that before their marriage, Elizabeth had given birth to another man's baby. Now, if this occurred, the other man may have been her lover or her attacker. Either way, her fiancé, the Count, is said to have tortured and killed the man, while the baby, when it was born, was sent away to be raised elsewhere and in secret. Elizabeth was her husband's social superior, which may explain why he would be prepared to overlook her having a baby with someone else prior to their marriage, if in fact she had done so. Her husband was frequently away at war, leaving Elizabeth to administer and protect both of their estates, which she would have been more than capable of doing, having been essentially raised for such a thing and so well educated. However, it is alleged that when he was at home, the Count and his wife would treat their servants incredibly brutally, and this behaviour was allegedly continued by Elizabeth in her husband's absence too. However, there is another conflicting and contradictory narrative about Elizabeth that shows her as a woman who expresses concerns for the difficulties faced by the local poor, the serfs, in her letters. Apparently, she was even willing to intervene on occasion to assist them where she could, and that's particularly true in the case of local poor women. But perhaps she could be both, cruel and caring. Perhaps these two things are not mutually exclusive. In 1604, Elizabeth was widowed. She and her count had been married for nearly 30 years, and they had had 4 or possibly 5 children, because accounts vary. It has been claimed that Elizabeth took lovers during her husband's periods of absence when he was at war, but there are no connected claims that any of the children were not his. It also seems that she would remain as resolute in protecting their assets after his death as she had been prior to it. When some of her lands were invaded by another noble, Elizabeth felt assured enough to make her own threats, when she wrote to him stating, quote, "So, my good sir, you have done this thing. You have occupied my small possessions because you are poor. But I do not think that we will leave you to enjoy them in peace. You will find in me a man." However brave she may have felt, her husband's death, and especially the inheritance he had left her with, made her vulnerable to all sorts of things. Apparently, rumours of the couple's cruelty to their servants had begun to circulate before the Count's death. There was an accusation that the Count had decided to punish one of their servants by having her taken outside, stripped, and smeared in honey to act as bait for insects to come and bite and sting her. Eventually, she is said to have collapsed, at which point the Count, witnessed and or assisted by his Countess Elizabeth, are believed to have placed oiled paper between her toes that was then set on fire in an attempt to revive the girl, presumably for her punishment to be continued rather than for any care of her. There were soon also some claims of vulnerable serving girls being murdered by this couple, and by Elizabeth alone, with the counter-argument or defence from the time being that they had died of cholera or from some other unknown cause that was definitely not being tortured to death for the sadistic thrill of a couple of Hungarian nobles. In 1602, a priest by the name of István Magyari was calling for the bodies of the dead to be exhumed, and was also making formal complaints about Elizabeth's allegedly torturous antics to the royal court of Hungary. Some allege that nothing was done about his claims because of the power and reach of the Bathory family, coupled with the fact that the alleged victims were only servants. The other version is that this Lutheran minister was being frustrated in his attempts to punish or subdue a Calvinist countess. At some point, the countess opened up her home and household to admit daughters of the nobility, and this was a common practice in early modern Christendom. Noble families would clamour to place their daughters in the most prestigious households. Considering the position enjoyed by the Bathory family, it's easy to see how the Countess's household would have fit the bill in this way. Presumably, that would only have been the case up and until around 1609, at which point the rumours about Elizabeth torturing and killing the young noblewomen in her care begin to circulate, just as they had done previously, apparently, about the servant girls who had been hired from the local peasant families. Some of her victims were said to be as young as 10. Most were apparently no older than 14. Elizabeth, who had allegedly been schooled in cruelty by her husband, had seemingly become more than his match and would continue to be so even after his death. I don't think I'm going to describe in full, gory detail every act that she and her accomplices, and the accomplices were a close network of her other servants, apparently. I don't want to list in gratuitous detail everything that they were said to have perpetrated against all of their victims, whether serf or noble, and that's mostly because it does involve fingernail stuff, and that makes me feel really squicky. However, the full list is, unsurprisingly, a feature of many, if not all, the articles about her, so it's very easy to Google if you do want to read it for yourself. But for anyone who has read the Marquis de Sade's 120 Days of Sodom, that text is basically a fleshed out copy and paste job of the charge sheet against her. So, victims were beaten, burned with fire, brands, tongs, or even, on at least one alleged occasion, a heated coin. They were said to have been placed in freezing conditions and or starved. Needles were allegedly used on various parts of their bodies. The victims were said to have been stabbed. They were also, in some cases, allegedly mutilated by Elizabeth when she would tear at their flesh with her own teeth. In 1610, King Matthias of Hungary sent his Palatine Georg Thurzo to investigate the allegations against the Countess. Thurzo took testimony from 300 witnesses and survivors. It would also be claimed that upon Thurzo's arrival at Ecsed Castle, a castle that had been gifted to Elizabeth at her marriage by her new marital family, and where Thurzo had come on the 30th of December 1610 to arrest the Countess, that he caught her red-handed. She was apparently in the act of torturing one victim while the body of another lay nearby waiting to be discovered. The servants, who were said to have been her accomplices in these tortures and murders, are said to have confessed, but it's thought they did so under torture themselves. Elizabeth would eventually be accused of murdering anywhere between 80 to over 600 young women. In fact, I saw 650 as an upper estimate of victim number. Based upon the details of her crimes, the Countess was perhaps the most depraved sexual sadist to ever have lived. Indeed, if we look at her entry in Guinness World Records, it reads as follows. The most prolific female murderer and the most prolific murderer of the Western world was Elizabeth Báthory, who practised vampirism on girls and young women. She is alleged to have killed more than 600 virgins in order to drink their blood and bathe in it, ostensibly to preserve her youth. So, Guinness World Records are seemingly absolutely assured of her guilt and the extent of it. That 600, maybe even 650 body count of victims, which is just breathtakingly large, isn't it? But where does that come from? Well, it looks like the large number of victims was apparently discovered because of a list of names kept in a book by the Countess herself. Now, interestingly, I could find no evidence of this book ever being presented as a physical object of evidence. It's just something that's talked about having been seen. As a result of the testimony and the various evidence brought forward, the so-called Blood Countess was locked away. She may even have been walled up in a room of Ecsed Castle. She would remain there until her death in 1614, when she was 54 years old. There are some potentially fairly tall tales about the Countess's life. For example, there are rumours that Elizabeth was schooled in Satanism and sadomasochism by members of her own family. And it's unclear when this particular narrative begins doing the rounds, but I have been unable to find any evidence that has emerged to actually support it. It's also alleged that her husband, who was apparently aware and supportive of his wife's incredibly violent predilection, would build her a torture chamber of her very own to her request and specifications. Another connected claim with this is that he is the one who taught her torture techniques himself, techniques that he is said to have drawn from his own experiences as a soldier at war. Additionally, perhaps the most famous, and certainly I would say the most often repeated allegation against the Countess was that, as well as all the torture and killing, that she would bathe in the blood of her virgin victims as a way of preserving her youth. And certainly we saw that allegation being repeated in the Guinness World Records entry about her. The allegation has also been taken up by proponents of the value of retrospective diagnosis, which is a technique that seeks to diagnose historical figures with psychiatric and medical conditions, things that we believe we understand in a greater degree than they would have done when they were alive. And they are attempting to use retrospective diagnosis to claim that, as well as bathing in the blood, she also consumed it, because she, in fact, they say, had Renfield syndrome. An alternative that some have even cited is that she may have had porphyria. And I think this is based upon a misunderstanding about porphyria, which believes that afflicted individuals have an insatiable desire to consume blood. In either case, regardless of which diagnosis we're going for, I think an attempt is being made to mitigate the charges against Elizabeth through trying to diagnose her with illnesses that might be claimed to impair her impulse control, making her perhaps less culpable. However, these stories of her consuming and or bathing in virgin blood belong to the years, even a century, after her death. But it's not just these aspects of the account that are being called into question. There are some historians who query most, if not all, of the charges that have been levelled against the Countess. Rather than being a brutal sexual sadist and serial killer, she was, they claim, a widow with wealth and power who was framed. Framed through 300 witness testimonies that were nothing more than hearsay, and a few pieces of outright deception, either due to torture or perhaps motivated by profit. But then we have to ask, who would want to frame her? Why would there be this concerted effort against her? Well, take that priest who made those early complaints about her behaviour to the King of Hungary. Now, it's been suggested that he might have been motivated by the doctrinal differences that existed between him and the Countess, being Lutheran and Calvinist respectively. The Hungarian king has been suggested to have been displeased by the support that Elizabeth is said to have shown to her kinsman, Gabor or Gabriel Bathory, who was the Prince of Transylvania. As I mentioned previously, the role of Prince of Transylvania was effectively a self-ruling principality. The Bathorys were, as we have mentioned, wealthy and powerful. This Bathory boy, with the support of his wealthy kinswoman, now could he have been a threat to the Hungarian king? Was he perhaps worried that the Bathory boy might defect, throw his support and lot behind a Habsburg invader, a threat to the Hungarian throne and the king's own autonomy? Might the Hungarian king have been keen to find a way to cut off the pipeline of support and finances to this perceived threat? Another suggested motive for Matthias wanting Elizabeth out of the way is that the king had significant outstanding debts that he owed to her deceased husband, debts that were now due to be paid to her. Elizabeth had apparently been a frequent visitor to the royal court in an attempt to get him to pay up. Her removal would allow him to ignore what he owed. It's even said that the king intended for her to be tried and executed, which would have enabled him to take her lands as his own. It apparently took Palatine Thurzo to convince Matthias that the scandal of a trial and execution of so prominent a figure would have been too embarrassing and potentially destabilising. However, perhaps it was simply a case that other nobles hoped to benefit from a potential land grab that might occur if she were tried and executed. So, was Elizabeth Báthory a torturous serial killer or a framed widow, someone who did her very best to protect the poor and educate the young women of noble birth? Or was she neither? Or perhaps somehow both? Some have suggested that it is possible that bodies did pile up around her, and that she may have been frequently witnessed being blood-soaked. But that was because she was attempting to medically treat the people on the lands that she controlled. We have seen that she was known to be a woman who loved learning. Could that love of learning have extended to medical treatments, including surgeries? Is it possible that if people from the local community were ill or even gravely injured, they knew they could go to the Countess's castle for help? Is it possible that some were simply too far gone to be saved? But if this is the case, then surely she wouldn't just be remembered as a killer of young female virgins. The body count and the victimology would also include men as well. So why is it just women? Well, if we want to stick down the medical surgical route, I have heard it be suggested that Elizabeth Báthory may have been acting as an abortionist, and perhaps the procedures went wrong. Perhaps that is why the bodies of young women, all thought to be virgins, were beginning to pile up. But one would have thought if that was the case, she would have just stopped. Unless, of course, she was using their living bodies as some kind of personal medical teaching tool. Perhaps there's simply some truth to the claims of sadism. Maybe Elizabeth Báthory was cruel to her servants. Maybe she was even very violent. Exploring the life of Countess Elizabeth Báthory is a bit like trying to focus a beam of light through a prism. The more you look at it, the more paths there are to follow. The Countess shifts, depending on your point of view, your position, I think. So in some ways I wonder if the person that we perceive her as being, who we think she was, whether that's a criminal or something else, I wonder if that tells us as much, if not more, about ourselves than it does about her, about the reality of her. But what do you think? Who, or perhaps what, do you think Countess Elizabeth Báthory was? And what makes you think of her in the way that you do? Now, this video ended up being quite a bit more philosophical than I had thought it would be when I set out to talk about this figure. But as always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video, or you can find me on social media. I'll leave links to the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. follow me over on some or all of them so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. And if you did, why not share it with your friends? Please also let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. And if you think you are subscribed, have a little check just to make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you. I have been seeing in the comments that people have checked and found out they were unsubscribed. So while you're there, checking, subscribing, perhaps resubscribing, why not hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button so that YouTube will tell you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.